Hello everyone and welcome back to another rousing discussion of anatomy and physiology. So the last time that we were in chapter 21 and we talked about blood vessels, we were just really talking about the anatomy of it. And really that's kind of how this textbook works, right? We talk a little bit about anatomy and then we spend the next half of the chapter talking about physiology. So that's pretty much what we're going to do today. So we're going to really talk about the physiology of how the blood vessels do their thing. And so once again, what is their thing? Physiology, how do they work? Their thing is really just gas and nutrient exchange, so we're going to talk about that. Now, before I go any further, a really good way to start this discussion off and to kind of give you a point of reference and a framework is to think about your understanding of diffusion and osmosis, because really that's what blood mostly is, right? It's water, and diffusion is just moving things from an area of high concentration to low concentration, and osmosis is just the diffusion of water. I also want you to kind of have an idea of this understanding of filtration, when something is being filtered out and through which it has to go through some sort of filter membrane to get out. So understand that concept of filtration, and also the concept of reabsorption, so things coming back in, being able to get through that membrane. Now if you can understand those very basic concepts, that's going to give you a really good start to understanding these what we call dynamics that are happening in the blood vessel. So at the blood vessels, in the blood vessels, there's going to constantly be this interplay, if you will, between filtration and reabsorption, and things that are going out and things that are coming in. Now, if we think about that, and it's a big picture sort of thing, that really makes a lot of sense for us because, right, we're filtering things like carbon dioxide and nutrients out of the bloodstream and into the interstitial tissues, to the surrounding tissues of that area so that they can have nutrients and they can have oxygen. And then we want to reabsorb things like carbon dioxide and the waste products so that they can go to their appropriate destination, whether it be the kidneys, the lungs, or the digestive system. We want to get it out of the body. So this dance of filtration and reabsorption, it's constantly happening. It's just a movement of these molecules, because when we get down to a really small level, that's what we're talking about, the movement of these molecules. So terms that I want you to be familiar with, and let's pull out our old sunshine here. Hydrostatic pressure is going to force water out of a solution. So hydrostatic pressure forces water out of a solution. So if we have one thing or one dynamic that's going to force water out of a solution, which we call hydrostatic pressure, then we should have something that's going to force water into a solution. And what forces water into a solution is our net osmotic pressure. So those two terms I want you to be very familiar with and understand how they're used, because you will see them again, and not only know what they mean as like a multiple choice type question, know what they mean, but also know what they mean as an understanding of how this actually works. And when you read it in a question, know what's being asked of you. So net osmotic pressure is going to force water into a solution, and then net hydrostatic pressure is going to force water out of a solution. So even though we gave them two different names, isn't that really filtration and reabsorption? Whereas filtration, water is going out, is being filtered out, where the other particles or solutes or plasma proteins and blood cells and all that other stuff, those albumins, those globulins, those are all going to stay in circulation, whereas water is moving out. Whereas net osmotic pressure is going to be the reabsorption aspect of it, where we're having water go back into the solution there. So really that's filtration and reabsorption that's happening. That's just different ways of talking about it. So both net hydrostatic pressure and net osmotic pressure are going to control this filtration reabsorption dance through the capillary beds. And remember, we call those our exchange vessels. So here's a pretty picture of all this good stuff happening, maybe not all of it, but a good chunk of it. So we have this capillary hydrostatic pressure. Hydrostatic pressure, capillary hydrostatic pressure, I don't really care that you know which name you prefer over the other. They're the same thing. So we have our capillary hydrostatic pressure, where we have these really large molecules like amino acids, blood proteins, and some other entities that are just too big to get through here, get through those pores or get through the plasma membrane. And remember, some of those pores that we talked about were the fenestrated capillaries that have the holes in them. So with net or the capillary hydrostatic pressure on here. We have our small solutes, things like glucose and some ions, and we can get those to go out along with some of this water here. And then we can see here that, you know, some of these smaller solutes they actually are being surrounded by water molecules, and that's how they're moving out. So we had our hydrostatic pressure forcing water out of a solution again, just as a reminder. So hydrostatic pressure is forcing water and some small solutes and ions out into the interstitial fluid, which is a good thing, because what this means, what this is the take-home message from this discussion right now, is that this surrounding interstitial fluid could be a place like, I don't know, your ear or whatever it is, or your knee or your toe, or whatever you want it to be. The blood vessels that are going to your knee or your toe or your ear, they're carrying these nutrients, water, glucose, sodium ions, potassium ions, whatever they may be, and some of those things are able to get out. So this interstitial fluid is not just some, you know, black hole that no one really knows where it is. This interstitial fluid are specific places and specific organs that are getting this blood flow. So, and they're not blood flow, but they're getting these nutrients and this oxygen that's being delivered to them, and water, most importantly in this case, water. So then we have our filtration. Once again, this is just kind of a recap of what we saw in the previous slide. Driven by hydrostatic pressure, remember that forces water out into the solution of the interstitial fluid. Not only does water go out, but you also have some things like small solutes are able to get out, like some of those glucose molecules, as well as some of those ions, things like sodium and potassium. But larger things, amino acids, and definitely blood cells, they should stay in solution. They'll stay in the bloodstream. Now, reabsorption is the other end of this. And in reabsorption, we have, this is as a result of osmotic pressure. So that's forcing water back into solution. So what blood collide osmotic pressure is that means that when the blood collide osmotic pressure is basically the pressure that's generated on the inside of the blood vessel and the inside of that capillary bed as a result of all of the formed elements that are in this. So all of the parts of the formed elements that are in there, and even some of the non-formed elements, things like plasma proteins that are too big to just kind of willy-nilly go through to be filtered and reabsorbed out very quickly, that pressure will become equal to what's on the outside to prevent the movement of water. So what that means is that the blood collide osmotic pressure equals the pressure required to prevent osmosis. So we don't want to lose any more water outside of the bloodstream, because at this point we want to start reabsorbing water. We saw the filtration taking place. We wanted water to go out. Blood collide osmotic pressure was not anything that we talked about. It wasn't anything to contend with, because we had that net hydrostatic force that was pushing water out into solution. At this point here, what we want to do is we want to keep water from moving out into solution, and in fact, we want to reabsorb some of that water out. So what causes this blood collide osmotic pressure is because we have a higher concentration of solutes or formed particles in the bloodstream as opposed to those that are outside of the bloodstream in the interstitial fluid. So water is not going to have a tendency to move out. Remember, diffusion says, and osmosis is just the diffusion of water, that water moves from an area of high concentration to low concentration. So at this point, when we are at the blood collide osmotic pressure, we're kind of at a stalemate, where we have these suspended elements that are in the blood that just never went out in the first place. They've now caused, they're not going to move out. So at a point, the concentration of water is the same, if you will, on both inside and outside of the bloodstream. Although the amount of water is not the same, the concentration is the same. So as we go a little bit further in time or in space, what we would find is that the water will be on a higher concentration in the interstitial fluid outside the bloodstream and will be driven back into the bloodstream. So this dance between filtration and reabsorption makes sure that the plasma and interstitial fluid are constantly communicating with one another, and they're always exchanging nutrients for waste products. This exchange, this interplay between reabsorption and filtration, and the way that our understanding of diffusion and osmosis and the blood kaleidoscopic pressure and hydrostatic pressure, this is going to facilitate the movement of nutrients, hormones, dissolved gases to ensure that they get through all of the tissues there. They also help to transport proteins and lipids and tissue proteins that can't really readily just enter the bloodstream through the capillary walls. It helps that process to take place, and it also acts as a bit of an immune response too, in that it's able to flush different types of bacterial toxins and other chemical stimuli to a different set of vessels, your lymphatic system. So it can push those things, and in fact, the venous ends of the capillary beds have a hookup with the lymphatic system, so that as this exchange is taking place, if there are some things that we don't want to go back into circulation that could be potentially toxic, right there at the venual end of the capillary bed, we have our lymphatic vessels that are just teeming with white blood cells, teeming with immune cells to deal with those infections, or possible infections, I should say. So this point of filtration and reabsorption doesn't happen right away in the capillary bed. In fact, it's kind of pushed off a bit, if you will, in that it's going to happen closer to the venous end. And that makes sense for us because we understand that the pressure is going to be much lower at the venous end of it, so we can have a much more efficient rate of exchange. And then also at the venous end, we have the lymphatic vessels that are found there as well, so that they can take care of some of those potential toxins and bacterial infections so they don't always make their way back into the bloodstream. The capillaries are going to filter more than they actually reabsorb. So although we have this dance that's happening with filtration and reabsorption between hydrostatic pressure and osmotic pressure that allows for this exchange of nutrients for waste and oxygen for carbon dioxide, and this is a discussion that we will go back to when we get to the respiratory system somewhat, more is going to be filtered out than is actually going to be reabsorbed. Not only do those lymphatic vessels help to elicit an immune response, they're also responsible for making sure that any excess fluid doesn't just always automatically go back into the circulatory system, into the blood vessels. They can also go into the lymphatic vessels, and that can help maintain homeostasis, or the relative volume of blood. So some more capillary dynamics, some terms that are excellent terms to know for fill-in-the-blanks, hint, hint. Hemorrhaging is going to increase reabsorption of the interstitial fluid, so you're going to recall more fluids, and the reason you want to recall more fluids is because you don't want to go into what's known as shock, or a drastic drop in blood pressure. Blood pressure, remember, is the pressure that's exerted on the blood vessel walls. Since a good chunk of your blood is water, if you are hemorrhaging out to kind of compensate for that lower or reduced volume of blood, your body is going to be triggered to increase the amount of reabsorption that's taking place of those surrounding fluids so that it can try to bring the blood pressure up. So what happens here is that capillary hydrostatic pressure and net filtration pressure are both going to be reduced. Why? Because technically they're all still leaving out. They're all still leaving out, you know, because we're hemorrhaging out. We're hemorrhaging damage to those blood vessels. In dehydration, that's going to increase the blood kaleidosmotic pressure. Now that makes sense to us because the blood kaleidosmotic pressure has really been established because of the filtration of fluids that we're leaving out of the circulatory system. So that blood kaleidosmotic pressure is going to definitely be higher because there is a lower concentration of water in the circulatory system. So as a way to deal with that, your body is going to accelerate reabsorption. It's going to try to increase even more of the amount of fluids that are, it's going to recall more fluids from the interstitial tissues to bring them back into the bloodstream, so that the concentration of water both in and out of the bloodstream is roughly equal, or that there's a much higher concentration if we're not having a whole lot that's in the bloodstream and the blood kaleidosmotic pressure has increased. If we have increases in capillary hydrostatic pressure or blood kaleidosmotic pressure, fluid moves out of the blood, and what can happen there is that it can cause a buildup of fluid in the surrounding tissues, which we call edema. There are so many things that could cause edema. It could be something as simple as ion uptake or too much ion uptake, too little ion uptake. It could be as a result of injury or infection. But if we just look at the capillary dynamics of this, anything that can really, in a nutshell, that can increase capillary hydrostatic pressure or increase blood collide osmotic pressure can have the tendency to move fluid out of the blood and can cause this edema. Now, if we have an increase in blood collide osmotic pressure as a result of dehydration, then that's definitely going to accelerate reabsorption. So this term, this is a little bit different than what we have here. If dehydration is the cause, then blood collide osmotic pressure is one of the results, and as a result, it's going to try to rectify itself, accelerate reabsorption. If this is a cause, something happens to increase the capillary hydrostatic pressure or the blood collide osmotic pressure that's not dehydration, then fluid can move out of the blood and will build up in the tissues. So just to make sure that you understand how an increase in blood collide osmotic pressure can allow for fluid to move out of the blood. It doesn't always necessarily mean that it's going to have an acceleration of reabsorption working properly to get that blood, the volume of the blood increased and to get that fluid back into the blood. So since we're talking blood vessels, we definitely have to go back to the heart. We have to talk about cardiac output again. Remember, cardiac output is to calculate that is heart rate times stroke volume on there. So some of the same things that control the cardiodynamics are also going to have some control over cardiovascular regulation. So autoregulation is a part of your nervous system that is completely just does this kind of thing on its own. We do have neural mechanisms that are going to come just straight from the brain and the spinal cord, and then there are even hormones that are responsible for kind of regulating this. And so all of these things that we talked about in the heart chapter, they kind of come back around again, in that they also have a role in cardiovascular regulation. So first one, autoregulation of blood flow within tissues. That can be adjusted by peripheral resistance, and that can keep the cardiac output the same. So the heart doesn't even have to like decrease or increase the heart rate or the stroke volume to kind of regulate that flow of blood within those tissues. So auto, remember, means self. So autoregulation is kind of like it's self-doing it. It's a DIY. It's kind of taking care of the issue itself. It's not outsourcing it. So local vasodilators are going to always increase the diameter of the blood vessels, and that's going to accelerate blood flow to the tissues. If we have something like a low oxygen or really high CO2 levels, we want to get rid of some of that CO2 because it's a waste product for us for the most part, or anything that causes our pH to be too low. Really high CO2 levels can make a low pH. Nitric oxides, too much potassium or hydrogen ion concentration. Hydrogen ion is an acid, so that would make the pH lower. Chemicals that are released by basophils and other cells that result in inflammation, that can also increase the diameter of the blood vessels, and even an elevated local temperature, which is something we talked about in one of our very first chapters here in AMP when we talked about the autoregulation as it relates to temperature. So these are all things that can cause the blood vessels to locally in that area to increase the diameter of the blood vessels. Why we want the diameter of the blood vessel to be increased is because we want to increase blood flow. Why do we want to increase blood flow to this area? Because blood is carrying the almighty life-giving element of oxygen, as well as carrying things like water and nutrients, and it's also able to take up some of those things like excess hydrogen or potassium ions or carbon dioxide and move them to their appropriate places for waste. Or to raise the temperature of that area, you know, it's got more flow of blood coming to it. So Vasoconstrictors are going to do the opposite of dilators, right? They're going to make sure the blood vessels are getting smaller. So things that are vasoconstrictors are things like prostaglandins and thromboxans. If you remember from the blood chapter, we talked about prostaglandins and thromboxanes when we talked about platelets and the clotting. So definitely if we have blood loss that's happening or we want clotting to take place, these things will trigger the blood vessels to locally in that area, not widespread, to constrict and become smaller to maybe reduce the amount of blood that's being lost. Damaged tissues can release vasoconstrictors or prostaglandins, and once those prostaglandins are released, and that can cause them to constrict, and it could be for a variety of different reasons. Maybe there's an infection and it wants to corral itself off so it can reduce the blood flow that's coming to that area in order to starve off oxygen from whatever it is that may be causing the infection. Vasoconstrictors can also have a role on determining what can get through the capillary sphincters and how fast they get through there by constricting those capillary sphincters, and they don't always have to affect the entire area. It can just affect a single capillary bed. So they can be very specific and targeted in whatever it is they're trying to do to regulate that blood flow that's going through the area. So some neural mechanism, you're probably very familiar with this. Cardiovascular centers are in the medulla oblongata, which is the oldest, most arcane portion of your brain. You have what are known as cardio-acceleratory centers that will increase the cardiac output, increasing heart rate, stroke volume, that sort of thing, or cardio-inhibitory centers that are going to reduce cardiac output. And either the acceleratory or the inhibitory centers that are found in the medulla oblongata, either of those that have been triggered will definitely affect blood flow. So basal motor centers, and also still under neural, we have the control of vasoconstriction is controlled by adrenic nerves such as norepinephrine. That's going to stimulate the smooth muscles that are found in the walls of those blood vessels to contract in their arterial walls. Vasodilation is controlled by cholinergic nerves like nitric oxide in particular, and that's going to relax that smooth muscle. The basal motor tone is just going to be the relative resting constriction and relaxation, that tone that's established in your blood vessels. You also have different types of pressure receptors that can affect vasomotor control that for the cardiodynamics, keep saying that, blood vessel dynamics. The carotid sinuses are going to maintain blood flow to the brain, and the aortic sinuses are going to monitor the start of the systemic circuit, and the right atrium is going to monitor the end of the systemic circuit. So what this really means in a nutshell is that varioreceptors are basically just pressure receptors, and they will, if the volume of blood that's coming into any of these places, the carotid sinus, the aortic sinus, or the right atrium, it's going to trigger or not trigger as much that pressure receptor. So if a large volume of blood comes into that area, then that receptor is going to be triggered, and that may increase heart rate. It may say that, hey, we've got a whole lot of blood that's coming into this area. We need to increase cardiac output. So we can have these things increase cardiac output, increase heart rate because of the sheer volume of blood that's coming into the area. So when blood pressure rises, the cardiovascular centers in the medulla oblongata is what MO stands for. They're going to decrease cardiac output as a way to control it, and they're going to cause peripheral dilation. So we don't want the heart to kind of be overworked, if you will. So as a way to, so when the blood pressure rises, there's a very high blood pressure, to compensate, that's the word I'm looking for that, then we can have a reduction in cardiac output, and then not only can we have a reduction in cardiac output, but we can also have the blood vessels become more dilated. The larger those blood vessels are, the less pressure that blood is going to be able to exert on the walls of those blood vessels, so that can reduce blood pressure. When the blood pressure falls, those cardiovascular centers in the medulla oblongata can increase cardiac output on there. So we can increase the amount of the heart rate or the stroke volume, and we're going to also constrict those blood vessels so that the pressure that's being exerted on those blood vessels is greater because the pathway through which the blood has to go through is smaller because of the constriction of those blood vessels. Chemoreceptors are kind of like baroreceptors in that they're going to detect changes. Unlike baroreceptors, chemoreceptors are going to detect changes in, that's right there in the name, chemicals. So changes in pH, how far we're getting away from 7.4, which is that slightly basic pH that we have in the blood, changes in oxygen and carbon dioxide concentrations. When those triggers are set off, then that can produce coordinating cardiovascular and respiratory activities in order to bring the body back into homeostasis or to deal with this issue, if you will. So unlike autoregulation, the things that we've talked about so far with this neural mechanism, these are more of your kind of outsourcing, if you will. This is where you're going to have to have the nervous system come in and help deal with this issue, mostly because it's much more widespread, so it's not something that can just be locally dealt with. Hormones, once again, just like neural, this is an outsourcing type of thing. These hormones can have a shorter or long-term effect on this cardioregulation. Epinephrine, norepinephrine from your adrenal medulla can stimulate cardiac output and peripheral vasoconstriction. So these are just an example of how all those different hormones we talked about in Chapter 18 in the endocrine chapter, any one of them for the most part can have an effect on cardiovascular regulation. So we don't spend a whole lot of time talking about that because there are so many of them. Ones that we are going to spend time talking about are things like antidiuretic hormone. And this is going to come back again when we get into the urinary chapter, so do not forget about it. Antidiuretic hormone is going to elevate blood pressure, and the way that it's able to elevate blood pressure is that it makes the body retain more water. More water that's retained, more water can go into the circulatory system. The more water in the circulatory system in the blood, the higher the volume of blood. The higher the volume of blood, the higher the pressure. So antidiuretic hormone works directly by reducing water loss at the kidneys, and antidiuretic hormone can be released in a response to a low blood volume, a high plasma concentration, and antidiuretic hormone can also respond to circulating angiotensin II. So elevations in the amount of angiotensin II is a signal to have more antidiuretic hormone released to increase the blood volume. Speaking of angiotensin II, this will be released if the renal blood pressure starts to fall. Renal blood pressure is the pressure in your kidneys. So when renal blood pressure starts to fall, let's go back here, that can stimulate the antidiuretic hormone to be released. When antidiuretic hormone is released, it's going to reduce water loss at the kidneys. When water loss is reduced at the kidneys, then it's going to be reabsorbed back into the circulatory system, increasing the volume of the blood. Increased volume of the blood increases the pressure of the blood, so increases blood pressure. Things that angiotensin II will do is, well, one of them we already saw, that it's going to increase the amount of antidiuretic hormone or ADH production. Aldosterone, it's kind of like antidiuretic hormone in that it helps to retain water loss, but it does it in a roundabout way. So it's going to actually retain sodium ions, and you've probably heard that old adage that water follows salt. So because sodium ions are retained, water will also be retained. It'll also stimulate thirst so that you can bring more water in from your external source, like, you know, a drinking fountain or your refrigerator. And then it's also going to stimulate cardiac output and peripheral vasoconstriction. And all of this is done in an effort to increase this fallen blood pressure. Natriuretic peptides, they're going to respond to excessive diastolic stretching. Remember, diastolic means the resting phase stretching. So if there's a lot of stretching when the heart's not having a contraction, if you will, then that can usually be an indication that the blood volume and the blood pressure may be too high. So the natriuretic peptides, specifically atrial natriuretic peptide, what they do is they lower blood volume and a lower blood pressure, and they help to reduce the amount of stress on the heart. So the way that your body responds to different types of exercise, this next section that we're getting into, the last section actually, is about cardiovascular response or cardiovascular adaptation. So we recognize and we understand that your body's not always doing the exact same thing all the time, right? Like, you know, right now you're listening to this lecture, you may be resting or sitting like I'm sitting or resting, or you may be listening to this lecture and you're on the treadmill. So your body has to adapt. Your cardiovascular system, not just your heart, but also those blood vessels, have to adapt to those changes. So the way that your body responds to exercise is going to differ between whether, well, of course, you're at rest, but it also depends on whether it's a light exercise that you're doing or a heavy exercise. And we've had an opportunity to look at our EKGs when we were doing light exercise or heavy exercise, and we recognize that light and heavy exercise for people is different for different people. If you're pregnant, then light exercise might be, you know, getting up and going to the bathroom. Heavy exercise may be taking a load of laundry to the laundry room. So it just depends on where your body is. At any rate, wherever you are for light or heavy exercise, the way that your cardiovascular system tends to respond is that in light exercise, you have a great deal of vasodilation that's happening because we want to increase the circulation to the blood that's going to your muscles. We want to increase the oxygen that's going there and the nutrients that are going there. The venous return is going to increase those. Venous return increases with muscle contractions because you're actually actively moving. So the more muscles contract, the more blood's going up through those one-way valves, and your cardiac output's going to rise. So that venous return is going to definitely increase, and that increase in venous return, which makes sense that it's going to be increasing because we've had more blood flowing, we call that the Frank-Starling principle. And as a result of this Frank-Starling principle, or the amount of venous return, then we should see the atria stretching a little bit more. So this is what we see in light exercise. Now with heavy exercise, your body is treating heavy exercise in the same way it would treat a situation which you were being chased by a bear, or you're going to have a total fight or flight thing that's happening. So with heavy exercise, you're going to activate your sympathetic nervous system. Your cardiac output is going to not just have a nice little rise, a little bump like you have with light exercise. It's going to increase to the maximum. Sometimes it's 4 times that of the resting level. All of the blood flow to places that are non-essential, i.e. your digestive system, that's going to pretty much be restricted greatly. Whereas, so that more blood can go to important places like your brain and your muscles. And so we said redirect blood flow to your muscles, lungs, and heart. Blood supply to your brain is overwhelmingly not super affected, but there is an increased amount of blood that's going to your lungs, and as a result, there's going to be a slight increase, a slight bump up to your brain. So when we look at this graph right here, I always like this graph because when we look at these subjects, a non-athlete at rest and the trained athlete at rest, and we have these different parameters that we're looking at. So the heart of a non-athlete is only about 300 grams, whereas look at the size of an athlete. Their heart is much bigger. My husband is a national champion wrestler, and whenever he goes to have he had to have a chest x-ray done one time because they thought he had tuberculosis. He had a TB that came back as a false positive, and they said, wow, you've got a really big heart. He has a really enlarged heart. Well, it makes sense. He has been at a high level of training his entire life that his heart is just more muscular than somebody that, is training for the Couch Olympics. So he has a very muscular heart. Because he has a very muscular heart, it's able to beat efficiently. That means that his heart can have fewer beats per minute to circulate more blood flow. So let's look at some of these other dynamics here. So the stroke volume for a non-athlete at rest is about 60 mils, whereas for an athlete it's about 100 mils. It's a pretty big jump. Non-athletes, their maximum is almost at the resting heart rate's maximum. And that, once again, relates to this really big heart that's able to have this very forceful, powerful contractions, really strong heart to pump that blood effectively. Cardiovascular training, that's really kind of what wrestling is, more than it is about strength. It's more about cardiovascular training that helps to increase the effectiveness of your heart beating. Beats per minute, non-athletes usually have more beats per minute than athletes. Athletes have around between 53 and 60. People that are in pretty good shape have higher beats per minute. their heart rate, if we get to the maximum, notice that the non-athlete has more beats per minute when they're at their maximum than the athlete does. And once again, that relates back to the efficiency of the heart being able to beat with fewer beats per minute and able to move higher amounts of blood. So cardiac output, between the rest, not really that much of a difference between the non-athlete and the athlete. But look at what happens when you're working your little buns off. We have 19.9 liters per minute. For a trained athlete, they're getting 30.4 liters per minute. And once again, that just relates to that very strong, efficient heart being able to pump blood and move blood more efficiently, having to contract fewer times. And then if we look at the blood pressure, non-athlete and athlete, that should be the same when they're resting, and then when they're doing their thing, when they have that heavy exercise, it's going to be much higher for the trained athlete on there. So long-term restoration of blood volume, we can always recall fluids from interstitial spaces when we need to maintain that blood volume. Aldosterone and antidiuretic hormone can both promote fluid retention and reabsorption. Thirst can increase, and we can also, if need be, it takes a couple of days, remember it doesn't happen overnight, we can also have erythropoietin be released so we can make more red blood cells. So that is all of Chapter 21. Here are the learning objectives that you all probably saw in the front of your notes of things that you will be responsible for on your next exam. I hope you all have a fantastic morning, noon, or night, and I will see you soon.